Night presses down on England like a held breath. It is June 5, 1944. Outside, the wind lashes the coast, churning the English Channel into a black, restless barrier of water and steel. Low clouds race overhead, heavy with rain, obscuring the moon and swallowing the stars. This is not the night anyone hoped for. This is not the weather chosen for the greatest military operation in human history. Inside a quiet room at Southwick House, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stands apart from the noise of staff officers and ticking clocks. The walls are lined with maps, Normandy beaches marked with codenames that will soon become synonymous with blood and sacrifice: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword. Pins and strings trace the paths of armies that do not yet know their fate. Eisenhower stares at the map, but his mind is far beyond paper and ink. He is thinking of young men packed into aircraft and ships, waiting for an order that will send them into history, or into the sea. For months, the Allied war machine has been tightening like a coiled spring. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, more than 150,000 troops ready to cross the Channel. Everything depends on timing. Everything depends on weather. And tonight, the weather is wrong. Reports arrive one by one. The seas are rough. Visibility is poor. Paratroopers could be scattered miles from their drop zones. Landing craft could capsize. German defenses, if alerted, could turn the beaches into killing fields. Delay, however, carries its own danger. Surprise may be lost. Morale may fracture. The invasion force cannot wait forever. Eisenhower listens. He asks questions. Then he falls silent. In that silence, the weight of command settles fully on his shoulders. No committee will share this burden. No subordinate can make this call. Historians will later analyze tactics and logistics, but at this moment, the war narrows to a single human decision: go or wait. Eisenhower thinks of failure. He has already drafted a statement accepting full responsibility if the invasion collapses. It sits in his pocket, a quiet acknowledgement that history may judge him harshly by morning. He thinks of the men who trust him without ever meeting him. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, teenagers from Texas and New York, about to face fortified machine guns and artillery. One man, one order, millions of lives hanging in the balance. Shortly after midnight, a new forecast arrives. A brief break in the storm, not perfect but possible. It is the opening Eisenhower has been waiting for, and the last he may get. He looks up from the table. "Okay," he says calmly, "let's go." With those words, the invasion of Normandy is set in motion. Radios crackle. Orders spread across airfields and harbors. Engines start. History begins to move. Eisenhower remains behind, watching the maps as the first icons shift toward France. He knows that by dawn, the world will be changed one way or another. Long before Dwight David Eisenhower stood at the center of the world's most powerful military alliance, he was a name few Americans recognized. He did not arrive at greatness through battlefield glory or tales of personal heroism under fire. There were no medals earned in muddy trenches, no dramatic charges against enemy lines. In fact, by the time the United States entered the Second World War, Eisenhower had never fired a shot in anger. For many within the Army's rigid hierarchy, that absence was not just unusual, it was disqualifying. Eisenhower's story begins far from the halls of power, in the small town of Abilene, Kansas. He was raised in a modest household, one shaped by discipline, faith, and hard work rather than privilege. There was no family legacy of generals or politicians to open doors. His path into the Army came through West Point, where he was known more for reliability and teamwork than brilliance. He graduated in the middle of his class, unremarkable on paper, carrying none of the distinction that usually marks future legends. As the decades passed, Eisenhower's career seemed destined for quiet obscurity. While other officers rotated through combat assignments and built reputations under fire, Eisenhower remained behind the lines. World War I came and went without him seeing the front. Instead, he trained tank crews in the United States, preparing others for a war he would never personally fight. To many of his peers, this cemented a damaging reputation capable, perhaps but untested. Within military circles, whispers followed him. He was labeled a staff officer, a planner, a man suited for paperwork rather than command. In an institution that prized battlefield experience above all else, Eisenhower appeared to lack the one credential that mattered most. Promotions came slowly. Opportunities passed him by. At times, it seemed entirely possible that his career would end in quiet retirement, his name lost among thousands of competent but forgotten officers. Yet beneath that unassuming exterior, something rare was forming. Eisenhower possessed an exceptional understanding of people. He studied personalities as carefully as others studied tactics. Serving under demanding superiors like Douglas MacArthur, he learned how egos could fracture commands and how diplomacy could hold them together. He absorbed lessons in coalition warfare, logistics, and long-term planning that no battlefield charge could teach. Where others sought personal glory, Eisenhower learned patience. Where others chased recognition, he learned restraint. When the Second World War erupted, the U.S. Army expanded at a pace never seen before. Suddenly, the demand was not just for warriors, but for organizers, leaders who could manage massive forces spread across continents. Eisenhower, once overlooked, found himself increasingly indispensable. His ability to coordinate, to listen, and to decide without spectacle began to stand out. Still, skepticism remained. Critics quietly questioned how a man with no combat record could be trusted with real authority. Could he command battle-hardened generals? Could he make life-and-death decisions under pressure? Could he lead men into combat he himself had never experienced? Then came the moment that would redefine him forever. Against all expectations, Eisenhower was elevated with astonishing speed. From relative anonymity, he rose to become Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. The responsibility placed upon him was unprecedented. He would not lead a single army or corps, but a vast coalition of nations: Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, and more, each with its own priorities, traditions, and rivalries. The irony was unmistakable. The general who had never fired a shot in anger now commanded the greatest invasion in history. Eisenhower understood the doubts. He felt them, even if he never voiced them. But he also understood something deeper. Modern war was no longer won by individual heroics alone. It was won by coordination, timing, and unity. His strength was not in pulling a trigger, but in aligning thousands of them toward a single objective. What once seemed like a weakness became his defining advantage. Free from the narrow perspective of a single battlefield, Eisenhower saw the war as a system, a vast, interconnected machine that demanded balance rather than bravado. And as the Allied forces prepared for their return to Europe, it became clear that destiny had been quietly shaping him all along, far from the sound of gunfire. Waging war against a common enemy was difficult enough. Holding together the most powerful alliance in modern history was something else entirely. By 1943, the Allied coalition was less a unified force than a fragile balancing act, a convergence of nations bound by necessity, strained by pride, politics, and profoundly different visions of how the war should be fought. At the center of this volatile equation stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one tasked with keeping the room from tearing itself apart. Eisenhower did not inherit unity. He had to build it day by day, conversation by conversation, crisis by crisis. On one side was President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the political architect of American power, balancing domestic pressures with global ambition. Roosevelt wanted momentum, decisive action, and proof to the American public that the enormous cost of war would lead to clear results. On another side stood Winston Churchill, Britain's indomitable wartime leader, whose strategic instincts were shaped by imperial experience and the scars of the First World War. Churchill favored caution, peripheral campaigns, and gradual pressure over direct confrontation across the English Channel. Between them, tensions simmered constantly. Every conference, every operation, risked reopening old arguments. Eisenhower was often less a general than a diplomat in uniform, translating strategic language into mutual trust. Then there were the commanders and the field men whose personalities were as formidable as their military reputations. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was meticulous, methodical, and unwavering in his belief that battles should only be fought under conditions of overwhelming advantage. He questioned plans openly, pushed back relentlessly, and demanded resources with unyielding confidence. To many Americans, Montgomery appeared arrogant. To the British, he was indispensable. Eisenhower had to manage both perceptions without alienating either side. At the opposite extreme stood General George S. Patton. Brilliant, aggressive, and volatile, Patton believed speed and audacity were the keys to victory. He despised restraint and openly criticized Allied leadership when operations slowed. His temper, language, and public behavior repeatedly threatened to embarrass the alliance and fracture it. Each of these men believed deeply in their own vision of victory. Each was indispensable, and none were inclined to submit easily to another's authority. Eisenhower's challenge was unprecedented command leaders who did not want to be commanded. He understood that issuing orders alone would not hold the alliance together. Authority had to be earned, not imposed. Eisenhower listened often longer than others thought necessary. He allowed strong personalities to vent, to argue, to clash, absorbing pressure rather than deflecting it. Where others might have asserted dominance, he chose patience. Where others might have escalated conflict, he searched for compromise. This was not weakness. It was strategy. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower mediated disputes that never appeared in official reports. He soothed Churchill's fears of another Gallipoli. He reassured Roosevelt that progress was coming, even when timelines slipped. He balanced Montgomery's demand for preparation against Patton's hunger for action. Every decision risked alienating someone powerful. Every misstep threatened unity. He didn't command egos, he survived them. Perhaps Eisenhower's greatest strength was his willingness to take blame. When operations faltered, he shielded subordinates from political fallout. When success came, he deflected praise. This quiet leadership built loyalty where orders alone could not. Men who argued fiercely in meetings followed him in action, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. As preparations for the Normandy invasion accelerated, the stakes grew higher. The alliance could not afford a public fracture, not now, not with millions of soldiers depending on seamless cooperation across land, sea, and air. Eisenhower's calm presence became the stabilizing force at the center of the storm. He unified not by erasing differences, but by aligning them toward a single, shared purpose. In the end, the Allied victory in Europe would rest not only on firepower and numbers, but on something far more fragile: unity. And it was Eisenhower, quiet, patient, and relentlessly steady, who held that unity together when it mattered most. Planning an invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe was not merely a military challenge, it was an industrial, logistical, and psychological undertaking on a scale the world had never witnessed. Operation Overlord was not built in a single headquarters or by a single mind. It was forged across continents, factories, ports, airfields, and intelligence cells, all synchronized toward one overwhelming objective: to return Allied forces to Western Europe and break Hitler's grip from the West. At the center of this colossal effort stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, overseeing a machine so vast it strained the limits of geography itself. An invasion so vast it bent the Atlantic itself. The numbers alone were staggering. By the spring of 1944, more than 3 million Allied troops had poured into Britain. Entire American divisions crossed the ocean in endless convoys, ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Ports clogged with cargo. Roads jammed with military traffic. Airfields multiplied across the countryside, carved from farmland and hedgerows. Britain itself became a launch platform, an armed continent preparing to strike another. Logistics formed the backbone of Overlord. Every soldier landing in Normandy would require food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and reinforcements delivered not once, but continuously, under enemy fire. Eisenhower understood that battles were won not only on beaches, but in warehouses and timetables. Millions of tons of equipment had to arrive at precisely the right moment. A single delay could unravel the entire operation. The problem was simple in theory and brutal in reality: how do you land and sustain an army on hostile shores without a functioning port? The answer lay in innovation. Engineers designed artificial harbors, mulberries, massive floating structures, towed across the channel and assembled under fire. Fuel pipelines, known as Pluto, were planned to pump gasoline directly from England to France beneath the sea. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. Failure was not hypothetical, it was expected. But without such solutions, Overlord would collapse within days. Then there was the landing itself. Thousands of landing craft were constructed, tested, and refined. Soldiers trained relentlessly along the British coast, rehearsing assaults that simulated the exact conditions of Normandy's beaches. Amphibious tanks were developed to swim ashore. Specialized vehicles engineered to clear mines, obstacles, and barbed wire were created specifically for the invasion. Every detail mattered. The angle of a ramp, the depth of the water, the timing of the tide. Above the beaches, air power prepared the battlefield. Allied aircraft bombed rail lines, bridges, and communication hubs deep inside France, isolating the invasion zone. Paratroopers were trained to drop behind enemy lines, seizing key roads and bridges before the first wave hit the shore. Their mission was confuse the enemy, delay reinforcements, and buy time with their lives if necessary. Yet even the greatest machine could fail if the enemy saw it coming. That is where deception became as critical as firepower. Operation Fortitude was a masterwork of strategic illusion. Entire phantom armies were created out of thin air, inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake camps visible from the sky. False radio traffic filled the airwaves, mimicking the communications of massive formations that did not exist. Double agents fed carefully crafted misinformation to German intelligence, convincing them that the invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Eisenhower personally oversaw this deception, fully aware that surprise was the invasion's most fragile asset. If the Germans concentrated their forces at the wrong place and held them there long enough, Overlord could succeed. Fortitude did not just mislead the enemy, it paralyzed them. As June approached, the invasion machine reached its final form. Ships were loaded. Men were briefed. Maps were sealed. Entire units disappeared into camps cut off from the outside world to preserve secrecy. Soldiers wrote letters they were not sure would ever be sent. Across southern England, the sound of engines and boots filled the air. From Eisenhower's perspective, the scale was almost impossible to grasp. Overlord was no longer a plan, it was a living system, stretching from American factories to British ports, from secret intelligence rooms to the beaches of France. Any failure, weather, timing, human error, could trigger catastrophe. Yet the machine moved forward. Because once set in motion, there could be no stopping it. The night of June 5, 1944, refused to cooperate with history. Rain swept across southern England, winds howled over airfields, and the English Channel churned violently under a moonless sky. For weeks, Allied planners had studied tides, winds, and moonlight, narrowing the invasion window to a handful of fragile days. Now, with the clock ticking down, the weather threatened to destroy everything before it began. Inside the Allied headquarters, tension thickened the air. Meteorologists delivered grim forecasts. Paratroopers could miss their drop zones. Bombers might fail to identify their targets. Landing craft risked smashing into obstacles or sinking outright. Every variable Eisenhower had tried to control now lay beyond human influence. Delay was still an option, but a dangerous one. Postponing the invasion meant breaking secrecy, exhausting troops already sealed in camps, and risking exposure to German intelligence. Worse still, the next acceptable tidal window would not arrive for weeks. By then, surprise could be lost entirely. German defenses might be reinforced. Hitler's reserves could be repositioned. The cost of waiting might exceed the cost of going. Eisenhower listened as his commanders debated. Some urged caution. Others believed the operation could survive imperfect conditions. The room was full of voices, but the responsibility belonged to one man alone. Shortly after midnight, a final weather update arrived. A narrow break in the storm brief, unstable, uncertain, but real. It offered no guarantees, only a possibility. The invasion would not be clean. It would not be easy, but it could happen. Eisenhower weighed the choice in silence. This was the moment no amount of planning could escape. No algorithm could solve it. No committee could dilute it. History would not remember the forecasts, it would remember the decision. At approximately 4:15 a.m., Eisenhower looked around the room and spoke the words that would unleash the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. "Okay," he said, "let's go." With that simple command, hesitation ended. The decision was irreversible. Across England, orders rippled outward like shockwaves. Aircrews climbed into their aircraft. Paratroopers checked their equipment in the dim red light of transport planes. Sailors cast off lines as engines roared to life. On the decks of ships, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, many silent, some praying, all moving toward the unknown. As dawn approached, Eisenhower issued a message to the Allied Expeditionary Force, words that would become among the most famous orders in military history. "You are about to embark upon the great crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." It was not a boast. It was not a promise of safety. It was an acknowledgement of scale and consequence. Eisenhower knew that by sunrise, thousands would be dead or wounded. He knew that success was not guaranteed. And yet, the order stood. In the early hours of June 6, the invasion began. Aircraft thundered across the channel, carrying airborne troops into darkness and anti-aircraft fire. Naval guns opened up along the French coast, their flashes briefly illuminating the shoreline. Landing craft surged forward through rough seas, waves breaking over ramps and decks. Many soldiers vomited from fear and motion. Others sat rigid, gripping rifles, staring straight ahead. There would be no turning back now. Eisenhower did not accompany the invasion force. He remained behind, pacing, waiting, watching reports arrive in fragments, confused, incomplete, often grim. For hours, he had no clear picture of what was happening on the beaches. Omaha was a slaughter. Utah was scattered. Airborne units were missing. Communications failed. Casualties mounted. He carried the burden quietly. In his pocket was a handwritten note prepared in advance. Should the invasion fail, it accepted full responsibility. No excuses. No deflection. Just accountability. It was never meant to be read aloud, but its existence revealed the depth of Eisenhower's understanding of what this decision truly meant. By mid-morning, the picture began to shift. Beachheads were holding. Despite chaos and bloodshed, Allied forces were ashore. The line had been crossed physically, strategically, historically. The decision at dawn had held. D-Day would not end the war, but it made its outcome inevitable. And it began with one man, facing impossible odds, choosing to move forward anyway into history, with no path back. Dawn broke over Normandy with no sense of triumph. It arrived cold, gray, and unforgiving, revealing a coastline transformed into a killing ground. As the first waves of Allied soldiers approached the shore on June 6, 1944, the scale of what they faced became horrifyingly clear. Concrete bunkers loomed above the sand. Machine gun nests were already awake. Artillery zeroed in. The Atlantic, moments before a barrier of water, now became a corridor of fire. Nowhere was this more brutal than Omaha Beach. Here, everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong at once. Rough seas scattered landing craft. Many amphibious tanks sank before reaching shore, leaving infantry without armored support. Bombardment from air and sea largely missed its targets, the German defenses intact and waiting. As ramps dropped, American soldiers were cut down almost immediately, some before their boots ever touched sand. Bodies piled at the waterline. Equipment sank into the surf. Medics were overwhelmed within minutes. Units became hopelessly mixed, officers killed or pinned down, radios destroyed. The carefully timed assault fractured into isolated pockets of men clinging to the shingle for cover, trapped between the ocean behind them and near constant fire from above. For hours, victory seemed impossible. On Omaha, some commanders openly considered evacuation. The beachhead was razor-thin, fragile, and soaked in blood. Every attempt to move forward drew devastating fire. Every delay meant more casualties. The invasion so meticulously planned appeared on the verge of collapse before noon. Utah Beach, though less catastrophic, was far from effortless. Strong currents pushed landing forces miles off course. At first, confusion reigned. Units landed in the wrong sectors, objectives unclear. Yet here, fortune intervened where planning had failed. German defenses were weaker, and American commanders adapted quickly. What could have been disaster became opportunity, but even at Utah, the price was paid in lives. Across all 5 beaches, the scene was chaos. Landing craft burned. Naval shells screamed overhead. The wounded cried out for help that often could not come. Soldiers hugged the sand, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, some fighting the urge to retreat back into the sea. Training collided with reality in the most violent way imaginable. This was not a clean assault. This was survival measured in yards. From headquarters, Eisenhower received only fragments. Reports were delayed, incomplete, contradictory. One message suggested Omaha might be lost entirely. Another spoke of airborne units scattered and isolated. For hours, He had no clear picture, only the knowledge that thousands of men were fighting and dying based on the decision he had made. Yet amid the carnage, something remarkable began to happen. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes no more than a dozen men, started to move. Without orders. Without coordination. Without certainty. Junior officers, sergeants, privates took initiative, crawling through gaps in the wire, scaling bluffs under fire, silencing machine gun nests one by one. Naval destroyers crept dangerously close to shore, firing point-blank into German positions to relieve pressure on the beach. Momentum, painfully slow and fiercely contested, began to build. By early afternoon, the impossible began to look merely improbable. At Omaha, thin cracks appeared in the German defenses. Exits off the beach were seized. The line did not break, but it bent. And that was enough. Casualties were staggering. Thousands dead, wounded, or missing in a single day. The beaches of Normandy earned their name in blood, yet the Germans had failed to push the invaders back into the sea. Against overwhelming resistance, the Allies had done the one thing that mattered most: they had stayed. As night fell on June 6, the beaches were still dangerous, still contested, still chaotic. But they were allied. The invasion had survived its most fragile hours. What unfolded that day was not the flawless execution of a master plan. It was a test of endurance under the worst possible conditions. It was courage in fragments, leadership at the lowest levels, and determination forged in terror. History would later call D-Day a triumph, but for those who lived it, it was something far harsher. It was the day when victory was nearly lost and refused to die. By the night of June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy had survived, but survival was not victory. The beaches were secured only in the most fragile sense. Allied forces clung to narrow strips of sand and shattered earth, surrounded by uncertainty. German counterattacks were expected at any moment. Supply lines were tenuous, casualties were staggering, and the question hanging over Allied headquarters was as stark as it was dangerous: should they pull back before everything collapsed? For Dwight D. Eisenhower, the answer was already clear. Retreat would not simply mean postponement. It would mean defeat. Retreat would have meant defeat. He chose endurance. In the hours after D-Day, reports continued to arrive, grim, uneven, and incomplete. Omaha remained unstable. Airborne units were still scattered. Some beach exits were choked with wreckage and wounded. German forces, though disorganized, were not broken. The Allies had crossed the Channel, but they had not yet escaped the coast. To withdraw now would expose the invasion force at its most vulnerable. Landing craft could be destroyed under fire. Morale would collapse. The Germans would claim a decisive victory and strengthen their defenses for years to come. A second attempt at a cross-channel invasion might never be possible. Eisenhower understood the stakes with painful clarity. The decision he faced now was quieter than the one that launched D-Day, but just as consequential. It required not bold movement but unwavering resolve. Hold the line, no matter the cost. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Commanders requested reinforcements faster than they could be delivered. Engineers struggled to clear beach obstacles under shellfire. Medics worked without rest, improvising aid stations amid the chaos. Supplies piled up at the shoreline, vulnerable to artillery and air attack. The margin for error was razor thin. Eisenhower refused to be drawn into panic. Instead, he focused on the long view, the strategy that had guided Overlord from the beginning. The invasion was never meant to be won in a day. Normandy was a foothold, not a breakthrough. The objective was to land, endure, and build overwhelming strength faster than the enemy could react. That strategy demanded patience under fire. Naval forces were ordered to continue running supplies ashore, despite the risks. Engineers accelerated work on the Mulberry harbors, knowing that without them, the invasion would suffocate. Air power intensified its campaign against German reinforcements, pounding rail lines and roads leading toward the front. Every hour the Allies held the beaches was an hour the Germans lost the initiative. Eisenhower also understood the psychological dimension of holding. Soldiers on the front needed to know that withdrawal was not an option, that what they had fought for would not be abandoned. Orders reflected that resolve. The message was implicit but unmistakable: stay, dig in, push forward when possible, and trust that support was coming. And it was. By June 7 and 8, reinforcements poured ashore. Tanks that had sunk or stalled were replaced. Artillery was emplaced. Command structures stabilized. Units that had landed in chaos began to reorganize. What had been fragments slowly became formations. What had been survival became resistance. German counterattacks came, but they lacked coordination and overwhelming force. Confused by Allied deception and crippled by air attacks, German reserves arrived piecemeal, too late to crush the beachheads. The moment to drive the Allies back into the sea slipped away quietly, irreversibly. From his headquarters, Eisenhower monitored the transformation. He did not seek dramatic gestures or public declarations. His leadership during these critical days was defined by consistency. No retreat, no hesitation, no deviation from the long-term plan. Endurance was the weapon. The beachheads expanded yard by yard, hedgerow by hedgerow. Casualties continued. Progress was slow and brutal, but the line held. In choosing endurance over withdrawal, Eisenhower preserved the invasion at its weakest moment. He understood that wars are often decided not at their most dramatic peaks, but in their most uncertain pauses when fear tempts leaders to step back instead of pressing on. Normandy was no longer a gamble. It was a commitment. And from that commitment, victory would grow. Once the Allied forces broke free from the beaches of Normandy, the nature of the war in Western Europe changed forever. What had begun as a desperate struggle to survive on a narrow strip of coastline evolved into a relentless advance that would shatter Hitler's defensive vision piece by piece. The Atlantic Wall, designed to be an impenetrable barrier, had failed. And with its failure came a strategic reality: the Third Reich could no longer escape. This was the turning point from which there would be no return. The fighting inland from Normandy was anything but swift. The Bocage country, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and fortified villages turned every mile into a battle. German forces fought stubbornly, using the terrain to slow the Allied advance and extract a heavy price. Progress was measured not in days but in yards. Casualties mounted. Tempers flared. Momentum threatened to stall. Yet the difference now was fundamental. The Allies were ashore in force, and they were growing stronger by the hour. Eisenhower's strategy emphasized pressure across a broad front. Rather than seeking a single dramatic breakthrough that could overextend supply lines, he aimed to keep constant stress on German defenses, forcing them to react everywhere and concentrate nowhere. This approach frustrated some field commanders eager for bold maneuvers, but it steadily drained the enemy's strength. In late July 1944, the stalemate finally cracked. Operation Cobra tore open the German lines near St. Lo. American forces surged forward, breaking out of Normandy and unleashing a mobile war the Germans could no longer control. What followed was collapse disguised as resistance. German units retreated, encircled, or disintegrated under relentless air attack. The once formidable Wehrmacht bled men and material it could not replace. Paris fell in August. The liberation of the French capital was not only a military achievement but a psychological earthquake. Crowds filled the streets. Flags returned to balconies. For occupied Europe, Paris was proof that liberation was no longer a promise, it was reality. For Germany, it was a devastating blow to morale and legitimacy. As Allied armies raced eastward, the question was no longer if Germany would be defeated, but how quickly. Still, the enemy was far from finished. In December 1944, Hitler launched one final gamble: the Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate attempt to split Allied lines, capture key ports, and force a negotiated peace in the West. For a moment, the offensive achieved surprise. American units were pushed back. The front bulged inward. Casualties spiked. Winter tightened its grip. But this was not 1940. Eisenhower reacted with speed and composure. He shifted reserves, reinforced threatened sectors, and allowed commanders the flexibility to respond without panic. Allied air power, grounded by weather at first, returned with devastating effect once the skies cleared. German fuel shortages crippled their advance. What began as a bold counterstroke became a fatal overreach. The Bulge marked Germany's last major offensive in the West. After January 1945, the strategic balance was no longer in question. The Allies advanced with overwhelming force. Rivers were crossed. Cities fell. The Rhine, long considered Germany's natural defensive barrier, was breached. Once Allied troops crossed into the German heartland, Hitler's fortress was exposed for what it truly was: a hollow shell held together by dwindling resources and collapsing morale. Eisenhower maintained pressure, coordinating American, British, and Allied armies as they closed in from multiple directions. German resistance continued, but it lacked coherence. The war machine that had once conquered Europe now fought for survival, not victory. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces were deep inside Germany. The end was no longer abstract. It was visible, tangible, unavoidable. Normandy had been the test. Paris had been the signal. The Bulge had been the last defiance. And the march into Germany was the conclusion. The strategic turning point was complete and irreversible. Hitler's fortress was broken not by a single blow, but by sustained pressure, unity, and endurance. From that moment on, the fall of Nazi Germany was not a matter of strategy, but of time. Victory in Europe did not arrive with celebration alone. When the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1945, the world saw images of cheering crowds, waving flags, and soldiers embracing in the streets. Newspapers declared triumph. Church bells rang. The war that had consumed an entire generation was finally over, but for Dwight D. Eisenhower, victory carried a weight that could not be lifted by applause. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had overseen the liberation of Western Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was the greatest military success of his life, and one purchased at a staggering human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded under his command. Entire towns lay in ruins. Families on both sides of the Atlantic would never see their sons return. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. Unlike some commanders who embraced public celebration, Eisenhower remained restrained. There were no grand speeches claiming personal credit. No triumphal declarations of conquest. When Victory in Europe Day arrived on May 8, 1945, Eisenhower acknowledged the moment but without spectacle. His tone was measured, almost somber, as if celebration itself required restraint. He had seen the casualty lists. Throughout the campaign, Eisenhower had insisted on accepting responsibility for every major decision. That sense of accountability did not end with victory. If anything, it deepened. Behind closed doors, he reflected not only on what had been achieved, but on what had been lost. Every advance from Normandy's beaches to the Rhine had been paid for in blood. The maps that once represented strategy now represented sacrifice. Those close to Eisenhower noticed the change. The calm confidence that had sustained the alliance throughout the war remained, but beneath it was a visible fatigue. The burden of command had left its mark. He had sent men into combat knowing many would not return. That knowledge did not fade with the enemy's surrender. Eisenhower never pretended otherwise. When visiting liberated concentration camps, the weight of the war became unbearable in human terms. The horror of what had been uncovered confirmed the necessity of the fight, but it also magnified its moral cost. Victory had ended the killing, but it could not erase the suffering already inflicted. Eisenhower ordered extensive documentation of the camps, ensuring the world would never be able to deny what had happened. This was not vengeance, it was responsibility. Even in success, Eisenhower avoided language of personal triumph. He consistently redirected praise toward the soldiers, sailors and airmen who had carried the burden of combat. He spoke of teamwork, unity, and shared sacrifice. The war, in his view, was not won by generals alone, but by millions of ordinary individuals who endured extraordinary conditions. That restraint set him apart. In an era when victory often produced legends larger than life, Eisenhower's leadership gained depth through humility. He understood that command was not about glory, it was about consequences. Every order issued from headquarters echoed on the battlefield. Every strategic success carried the shadow of lives lost. This perspective shaped Eisenhower's conduct after the war. He resisted calls for excessive punishment or prolonged occupation driven by anger. He supported rebuilding and reconciliation, recognizing that lasting peace required more than military dominance. The war had shown him the cost of division. He would not romanticize it. Victory, for Eisenhower, was never a personal achievement to be celebrated without reflection. It was a responsibility fulfilled and a burden carried forward. In the end, his greatness lay not only in the battles he won, but in the way he bore the weight of those victories. He did not revel in conquest. He honored sacrifice. And in doing so, he revealed the true cost of command measured not in medals or parades, but in lives forever changed. When the war ended, Dwight D. Eisenhower did not fade into history as a victorious commander content with past glory. Instead, he carried the lessons of global conflict into a world struggling to rebuild itself. Few men in American history have made the transition from military leadership to national leadership with such lasting impact. Eisenhower's legacy did not end in Europe, it expanded across the second half of the 20th century. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had learned the hard truth that power without restraint leads to ruin. As President of the United States, he applied that same understanding to a new kind of battlefield. Elected in 1952, Eisenhower led a nation emerging from war into the uncertain terrain of the Cold War. The enemy was no longer massed armies on beaches, but ideology, nuclear weapons, and global tension that threatened to spiral into catastrophe. Eisenhower governed as he had commanded calmly, deliberately, and with a long view. He resisted reckless military escalation, even when pressured by political and military voices, calling for confrontation. He understood the cost of war too well to treat it lightly. His warning about the military-industrial complex was not theoretical. It was born from experience at the highest level of command. At the same time, Eisenhower helped shape modern America at home. The interstate highway system, originally inspired by military logistics, transformed the nation's economy and connectivity. His administration worked to maintain stability, manage alliances, and prevent another global conflict from erupting. These were not flashy achievements, but they were enduring ones. What made Eisenhower unique was not ambition, but responsibility. He did not seek power for its own sake. Power was something he accepted when duty demanded it. From Normandy to the Oval Office, his leadership was defined by discipline, humility, and an unwavering sense of consequence. The lesson of Eisenhower's life is clear: true leadership is not about dominance, ego, or spectacle. It is about endurance, restraint, and the courage to carry the weight of decisions that affect millions. He proved that the qualities required to win a war are the same qualities needed to preserve peace. He didn't just win a war, he shaped a century. Eisenhower's story reminds us that history is not only made by moments of violence, but by the character of those entrusted with power. His legacy challenges us to ask difficult questions about leadership in our own time, and to learn from a man who understood both the cost of action and the cost of restraint. If this story helped you see World War II and American leadership through a deeper lens, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and join the discussion below. History lives on through those who choose to remember it.